We are joined today by Dr. Blaine Bettinger, who is an intellectual property attorney as well as a genealogist specializing in DNA. Producer Pat and I have both taken DNA tests to try to ascertain our background, our ethnic background. So, Dr. Bettinger, to begin with, when we take a DNA test like this, and we took the Ancestry.com DNA test, I also did an additional test from 23andMe. This is a saliva test. How do these tests, generally speaking, work? What can they tell us, and what can they not tell us?
So these tests are mainly used for two different things. The first is to give us an idea, a very high-level overview of our what's called our biogeographical ancestry, or what some people call our ethnicity ancestry. So, for example, a continental level, where what percentage of our DNA is European, African, Asian, Native American, and so on. The second thing we can learn from this is we can find our genetic matches in the database, other people who are our genetic relatives that have also taken these types of tests.
And when you're talking about genetic relatives, as we'll, without giving away any of the results yet, genetic similarities do not necessarily correlate directly with sort of a family tree match. Is that sort of accurate, or how can we think about that?
Well, actually, I would say it in the reverse.
Ah,
Having a genealogical match does not mean you're going to genetically match them, especially for more distant relatives. But if you have, say, a second cousin or closer that's already tested, you will match their DNA, and you'll be able to get a rough estimate of what your relationship is just based on the amount of DNA you share with them.
all right, very good. So let's start digging into the results. Let's start with David Pakman Show producer Patrick Ford. Pat, give us your sense of, as far as you knew, based on the stories that your family sort of had, what
Okay.
did you believe before taking this test was your background in terms of what these DNA tests can tell us?
So, from my understanding of my genetic background, most of my ancestors came to America around the turn of the 20th century. And on my paternal side, it's mostly from the British Isles. That's what I've been told. So, of course, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And then my maternal side is split. My expectation was evenly between Lebanese and Eastern European slash Polish.
Okay, so Dr. Bettinger, that's Pat's understanding of his family background. Let's now dig into Pat's actual DNA results. What can we glean from them?
Well, first we look at, I generally start off by looking at someone's ethnicity analysis. So for example, Pat's ethnicity analysis revealed a percentage of 80% European,
Hmm.
and there was around 20% West Asian or Middle Eastern. And so that doesn't quite break down to the 50-50 that you might expect if based on solely on what we just heard from Pat, but it's close. We have this sort of um, Great Britain, Ireland, Eastern European breakdown of European, and then we also have this Middle Eastern, West Asian percentage as well.
Now, Pat, when you saw, because when we're looking at the results here, when you saw the Europe East part, that does not really correlate with what your understanding was of your background, right? I mean, we're seeing Great Britain and we're seeing Ireland as far as the European part, but Europe East, did you know anything about that?
I did because my maternal grandfather I knew either came from Poland or Russia, and of course the border went back and forth over the years from there. But what it was a surprise was Italian slash Greek. I had no understanding that I had any of that, and I think it says what, about 8 or 9% come from that area.
Okay, so Dr.
Yes.
Bettinger, this gets to sort of my next question, which is when we got these results, there are what are called high confidence and low confidence results. And we'll see in mine that I have some very low confidence results. What does that really mean? Does that mean that there may be some sort of coincidental DNA overlap, but it may not necessarily represent an area of someone's background? Or how valuable is that to us?
That's a really good question, and that's probably one of the most common concerns and questions about these ethnicity estimates, and that is that they're not a perfect science. It's very, very rough science, because what happens is you get your DNA and it's compared to these reference populations that are obtained from these different places. There are groups of individuals that have been tested from Great Britain, Eastern Europe, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and your DNA is compared to these individuals. But if you think about it, there are very few populations today that have been in this region and isolated in any one region for thousands of years or even hundreds of years. There's been lots of intermixing, especially, for example, all along the Mediterranean. There's been plenty of mixing of populations there. From Ireland to Great Britain, lots of mixing there, all across Central Europe. And so what happens is it's hard to say that if you get say a 20% Ireland, for example, that's it, perfectly 20% Ireland. And in fact, each of these percentages have ranges, because this analysis is run multiple times by this company. So if you click on any of your percentages, you'll actually see a range that was along those different, that was for each of those ethnicity predictions. So for Ireland, the range may be 10% to 30%, and the average was 18%, for example.
Sure. All right, let's now get to my results. My understanding of my family background was quite boring in a sense. I mean, as far as I knew, I am of Ashkenazi Jewish origin. I'm not aware of any blood relatives that were anything but 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. What would not have surprised me from my results would have been if there was some Asian DNA, because in the part of Europe, Eastern Europe, where I believe my family to be from, it was not that rare to have some mixing with Asian countries. But beyond that, certainly what would have been a big surprise to me would have been, you know, a significant African origin or something like Indian, for example. So, Dr. Bettinger, let's put my results up on the screen and we can start getting into those. What are the key points of my results?
So really the first thing that jumps out at you is that 92% European Jewish ancestry. And I think that lines up very, very well with exactly what you were expecting to see.
Yeah.
Beyond
go ahead,
that,
yeah.
if you click on your low confidence regions, for example, you do see there are some very small percentages of other places, like 2% Italy, Greece, for example, 2% Finland, and a few smaller percentages. So those may be instances of either there might be some noise there, or there could be that there have been there's been these populations that have been introduced into your Jewish ancestry at some point in time.
Would it be accurate to say that based on the results that that we have here that we're looking at, that the only result that I received with any degree of confidence is an Ashkenazi Jewish background? Is that fair?
I think that's fair to say, yes.
Wow.
The confidence in that is extremely, extremely high, but the others, I would say, I wonder whether or not they're noise. And so generally what I do is I only look at the continental level. I like to look at how much European, how much African, how much Native American, how much Asian, and that's where I get the most confidence. Below that, once it starts breaking down into regions, that's where the science gets a little bit more challenging.
So overall, I have a 99% European test and 1% Africa. But when you look at that 1% in Africa, again, it's a 1% low confidence result from North Africa. Is that potentially completely meaningless here?
It is potentially meaningless, but what I know about that is the fact that it is a North African estimate. And so if you click on that, you actually see it's Africa North, which could be that upper coast of the of Africa along the Mediterranean there. And so again, there was a lot for thousands of years. There's been a lot of travel across the Mediterranean, both back and forth across there. And so it's possible that at some point in time, there was this African introduction of DNA.
In your expert opinion, as someone who's looked at a lot of these results, am I the most Jewish person whose results you've looked at? I mean, it seems as though it's possibly just a little bit of noise and then an Ashkenazi Jewish background as I look at it.
Yeah, I have to say it's one of the most Jewish backgrounds, Jewish estimates I've ever seen. So yes, absolutely.
Wow. So, I mean, I guess what we can gather from this is the story that I was sort of told growing up, and based on the family tree that I've put together, it does appear to be more or less accurate. There were really no surprises whatsoever here, but this doesn't rule out the possibility that one of these other minor regions at some point saw some intermarriage.
Yes, I think that's a perfect assessment. Yes.
Wow. Well, I wish my results were sort of more interesting. I mean, I guess it's interesting to confirm. In your experience, how common is it that there are no surprises? In other words, we heard about the white supremacist who ended up being 14% African, for example. That video went viral a couple of years ago. That was a big surprise. But by and large, are surprises pretty rare on these tests?
I've found in my experience that a large percentage of people do have surprises in their results, primarily because if you think about it, very few of us can build back a family tree back a number of generations that doesn't have holes. And so you never know what that hole, that brick wall in your tree might represent. And so I
Hmm.
think people do find ethnicity estimates or matches or other things in their results that tend to be surprising. And of course, there's a very large number of people that find extremely big surprises. Things like my parent was not my parent, or I'm adopted, or they find
Well,
a biological family, for example. So those are happening with greater and greater frequency. Not a huge percentage, but still, it's happening more and more.
okay, a couple other quick things before we let you go. On my test, one of the things Ancestry.com will tell you is the number and even give you specific information about other DNA matches. Now, when it comes to people of an Ashkenazi Jewish background, you said that those DNA matches can sort of, they need to be interpreted maybe a little differently. Can you talk about that a bit?
Absolutely. If there's a large percentage of Jewish ancestry, then what happens is your matches appear to be closer than they are in many cases because there's something called endogamy. Now, endogamy, all it means is that there is a higher amount of shared DNA as a result of intermarriage within a population for a large amount of time.
Hmm.
So, for example, in Jewish culture, it's common for this intermarriage to occur. And so, as a result, we have this increased amount of DNA that's shared between individuals from within that population. So, for example, if you have a predicted third cousin, for example, then that third cousin might actually be more distant genealogically. Genetically, they share more DNA because you come from this shared background.
Very good. And then the last thing I want to touch on, and we actually can put this up on the screen. I also did a 23andMe DNA test. Part of this was I was sort of curious whether this entire thing is a scam. If my results would have been drastically different between Ancestry and 23andMe, there would have been some questions to answer. Fortunately, the results from 23andMe were very similar. But on this last image, which we have that we can put up, my Neanderthal variants, Neanderthal DNA, which according to the 23andMe test, I have fewer Neanderthal variants than 59% of 23andMe test takers or customers. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Right. So we're just beginning to understand Neanderthal DNA. And it appears, based on some recent studies, some very good studies that were done, it appears that humans and Neanderthals, modern humans and Neanderthals, interbred. And so as a result, most non-Africans throughout the world have a certain amount of Neanderthal DNA, it appears, a low amount, somewhere between 1 and 5% or so. And it appears that intermixing occurred in Europe. And so that's why, for example, Africans don't seem to have that large percentage of Neanderthal DNA. What's interesting is they've identified some variants, some DNA variants that appear to have come from Neanderthal ancestry or Neanderthal DNA. And so what 23andMe does is they will look for those variants in your DNA and they'll report them to you if you have a high percentage. And you're lucky. I think my percentage is actually much higher. So you're less Neanderthal than I am, for
Now, you
example.
said lucky. Are there any objectively positive or negative sort of connotations to having more or less Neanderthal DNA?
Not that we're aware of. However, the fact that there's this consistent low-level amount of Neanderthal DNA in our genomes suggests that it was beneficial to us in some way, that we maintained that low level because it provided us with some advantage. And that science is still out there. I've seen a couple of papers that have talked about that, and I expect there to be a lot of interesting developments in that area in the future.
And for people who are interested in reading more about that, in Yuval Harari's, not his most recent book, Homo Deus, but the previous one, Sapiens, he actually writes somewhat extensively about what we're now learning about intermixing between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. Dr. Blaine Bettinger, absolutely fascinating. I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking to us about this today. Pat, any other questions you have for the doctor?
So I noticed 3% from the Caucasus Mountains and 1% Indian in my results. That certainly threw me as a surprise. I didn't have any expectations of that. In your experience, do you think that makes sense? Do you think that jives with my results?
Caucasus definitely does, because that's in the right region. However, the Iberian Peninsula, for example, those are all pretty low levels. Anything I generally say around 1% or less, I generally will be concerned that it's just noise. Above that, it appears to be a generally pretty accurate estimate as far as, you know, the general caveats about ethnicity estimates go.
All right. Dr. Bettinger, thanks again for being on. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.